Good morning, and welcome once again to the Elizabeth Seton Lectures. I'll not repeat the lengthy introduction given to Dr. Vogels last night, but for those of you who are here for the first time, I'd just like to say that Dr. Vogels is a well-known lecturer, not only here in Canada, but in most of the parts of this world, actually, even as far away as Australia. He is a member of the Society of African Missionaries called the White Fathers, and he teaches presently Hebrew Bible or Old Testament at St. Paul's University in Ottawa. His publications are too numerous to even mention, actually. He has published over the years over 100 articles in scientific journals. He has a dozen books to his credit, and as I said, he is a very well-known lecturer. Last night, he spoke to us on interpreting the scriptures in the 90s, and his focal point was what he is calling the intention of the author. I think it is a good measure of his competence and probably a good mark, the mark of a good teacher also, that he was able to talk about such complex matters in so simple a fashion, actually. This morning he will continue to treat the topic interpreting the scriptures in the 90s, and the focus this time will not be on the author, but on the reader. So let's welcome once again Dr. Vogels.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Good morning. I suppose that some of you did not hear me last night. I hope that this lecture stands on itself so that you can easily follow the lecture even if you were not last night. What I tried to explain to you yesterday was what happens to a text if we are trying to figure out what the writer had in mind when the writer was writing the text. This morning we are going to look at the other actor of reading, which is the reader. And I will proceed in the same way. I will first of all explain the theory and the presuppositions of such an approach to texts. After that, I will apply it upon one biblical text, the story of paradise, and we will conclude with a few observations about the advantages and the limitations of a reader-centered interpretation. So first of all, what is a theory? As we said last night, there would be no book if there was no writer. So obviously the writer is extremely important. But on the other hand, there would be no communication if there was not a reader. If you write a book in the hope that someone is going to read it. If a book is not read, a book is a piece that you put in a library, that you put in a museum, but the book is dead. The book waits for the reader to give it new life. And so it has been said that each reader, in a certain sense, rewrites the book. In the past, we have been inclined to stress the importance of the author, and of course it is the name of the author that appears on the cover of the book. But the reader is as important, even to the point that when you write a book, you are thinking already of those who are going to read your book, because your writing is going to be different. If you write for your colleagues, for your peers, you are going to write differently as if you write for, let's say, for a more general public. And even the publishers, they will ask you for what public you were writing. Because this is going to affect their publicity, for instance. In an author-centered interpretation, like we said last night, there are two elements which can change the reading of the text. This is who wrote the text and how the person wrote it. But if we look at a reader-centered interpretation, there are also two aspects that are going to change a lot. And what are those two? First of all, the clarity of the text, and secondly, who is the reader? So let us reflect now, first of all, upon what we could call the clarity of the text. Anyone knows how difficult it is to write a clear text, especially if you want to write something important. What are you doing? You write your text, and you read your text, you say, no, that's not exactly what I wanted to write. So you correct your text, and you start all over. And you read it again, say, no, it's not clear enough, you correct again. And nowadays with the computer, it's so easy to correct and to correct and to correct. But of course, you cannot spend the rest of your life correcting your text. At a certain moment, you say, okay, that's it. And this is your final text. But you accept as a writer that in a certain sense, that text more or less carefully tries to say what you want to say. Now, if the writer is fortunate enough to have a reader, do you see that the reader now will start interpreting? It may happen to you, and I suppose all of us, we have had that experience, that you received a letter of a person that you know quite well. And you read that letter and you say to yourself, I'm certain that's not what the person wants to say. Why? Because the person forgot a comma. Because the person forgot one little word in the sentence. And you say, I'm certain that's not what the writer wants to say. You can do this because you know the writer very well. But I have difficulties to say Matthew forgot to put a comma in this verse here. It may have happened in your life that you wrote a letter and that the person who received the letter answered you, and you say, but the person did not understand at all what I wanted to say. And you go back to your original copy and you say, now I understand why the person reacted the way the person reacted. Why? Because you start seeing that indeed what you wrote was open to 2 or 3 or 4 different interpretations. So all this illustrates that there is certainly a difficulty between what you want to say and what the text says. And besides the difficulty of being clear, there is another difficulty that's in the text. A writer must and always give some freedom to the reader. Can you imagine how boring a text would be if the text would spell out every detail? Reading is exciting because you do something. You have to be creative. You have to let your imagination work a little bit. So this is what we call the gaps in a text. And let us now reflect a little bit upon what we mean by gaps in text. So gaps that the reader has to fill in. There are, first of all, what is called grammatical and syntactical gaps. Grammatical and syntactical gaps. And those gaps are based upon all kinds of things. I will give you a few examples of that. Some gaps are due to the ambiguity of language in itself. All language has some aspects of ambiguity. There are people in literature, a sentence which is quoted quite often, and I did not change the sentence because you will see the sentence is extremely clear to show what ambiguity of language means. is the following sentence. Charles makes love with his wife twice a week. So does John. I don't know why you laugh. Because there is nothing bad with that, no? Unless you have evil spirits. So you all have understood that a sentence like that is open to two totally different interpretations. When we speak about the love of God, do you see that the love of God can mean two things? The love that God has for us, or the love that we have for God. Now you say, of course, the context is going to clarify that. And I say, yes, quite often, but not always. So this is a first gap that we call a grammatical or a syntactical gap. There is a second frequent syntactical gap that arises from the pronoun and its antecedent. May I ask you to take again the text of the Paradise story, because that's the text that we are going to use again today. And I'm going back to a verse that I referred to last night in Genesis chapter 3, verse 15. Genesis chapter 3, verse 15. You remember that I mentioned to you yesterday that in the Hebrew language, the pronoun that's used in the text is who. The Hebrew pronoun who, when I have to translate it in English, can be translated by he or it, because who in Hebrew can be masculine or neutral. Now, may I ask you to look at that verse 15. In our translations that we have on the sheet that you have received, which is a translation of the Jerusalem Bible, the text says, I will make you enemies of each other, you and the woman. So the text refers to the fight which started between the serpent and the woman. And that fight will go on from your offspring and her offspring. So in other words, the fight that started between the serpent and the woman will continue between the offspring of the serpent and the offspring of the wife. It will crush your head, and you will strike its heel. Now, if you translate that who by it, then it refers to what? It refers to the offspring of the woman. So, in other words, to humanity. In other words, the text says that humanity will crush the head of the serpent. Evil. Okay? But if you translate now by he, if you translate by the masculine, as for instance the New American Bible does, and as the Revised Standard Version does, then of course you speak about an individual. In other words, the fight which started in paradise between the serpent and the woman, which continues between the powers of evil and humanity, he will crush your head. So he is an individual, a male individual, and then that text refers to the Messiah. Ambiguity, gaps of the text, and there is no way that you can determine that you can fix that. A third gap which occurs quite frequently in text is when words that are used have 2 or 3 or 4 different meanings. And here again I would like to use and to show 2 examples here in the story of paradise. If you take chapter 2, verse 7, in the beginning of chapter 2, verse 7, the text speaks about Ha-Adam. Ha-Adam. Now, Ha-Adam, Ha is the article. Adam means humanity. Humanity, a human person, and of course you all have heard about a person with the name Adam. Now when you have a word with an article, obviously this is not a proper name. This refers to humanity, a human person. Now when it comes to verse 20, you have verse 20. The man, Ha-Adam, gave names to all the cattle, all the birds of heaven, and all the wild beasts, but no helpmate suitable for Adam. The article has gone. Now, Adam could mean what? No suitable helpmate was found for a human person, for a man, or for Adam. The text is ambiguous. Another example, again taken from Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, and I come back to that text that we just mentioned there. I come back to the text on the end of verse 15. It will crush your head and you will strike its heel, says the text. Now in Hebrew, the verb which is used is shub. And by the way, do you see that the Jerusalem Bible translates, I will crush, and you will strike? But in Hebrew, it is the same verb that's used. The same verb there. Now, what does that verb mean? And this is one of the difficulties, because the verb is only used twice in the Bible. So when a verb is only used twice, do you see how difficult it is, the meaning? Now, comparing with other Semitic languages, in Akkadian there is a verb close to the verb that we have here, which means to crush and also to watch. Double meaning. And so now some translators, they say, since the text uses the same verb, we should translate twice in English the same way. And so people translate, it will crush your head and you will crush its heel. In other words, the text says that that fight between humanity and evil is hopeless. While humanity crushes the head, evil is still crushing the heel. So in other words, there is no hope. But some other people say, since the verb has 2 meanings, the writer is playing on the double meaning of that verb. And we should translate, humanity, it is going to crush evil, even if evil is still trying to get at you. But the victory belongs to humanity. Do you see the differences? If you follow me? And if you accept now that last interpretation, then the text speaks about hope. But if you now include what I just said a few moments ago, now do you start seeing who gives hope? If you translate who by it, it is humanity which is going to conquer evil. But if you say he, then of course hope is given us through the Messiah. And there you go, the difficulties of the text. Secondly, besides what I called grammatical and syntactical gaps in texts, there are also, secondly, poetic and literary gaps, poetic gaps. What do we mean by that? Between the sentences of a text, there are all kinds of connections that are made. And of course, the writer is not going to state all the possible connections explicitly. Many are there implicitly. And sometimes writers are making big jumps and leave the task to the reader to fill in the gaps. And I'm giving you an example, a simple example again, taken by Eco. And Eco gives the following example. He says, if you have in a text that says this here, A says, okay, a person says to another person, I am out of petrol. We will say out of gas, but anyhow, I am out of petrol. And B answers, there is a garage round the corner. Do you notice the big jumps that are made here in the text? And Eco now explicits all that. And if a writer would write that, how boring that would become. Because what we have read there in that story where one said, I am out of petrol, and the other says, there is a garage round the corner, means what? That A needs petrol, and B wants to help him. B knows that A knows that usually garages sell petrol, and knows that there is a garage round the corner, and knows, or hopes, that this garage is open, and that garage has petrol to sell. Do you? Exciting, eh? So he informs A about the location of the garage. Do you see that as a reader, we have to fill in all those jumps, those gaps? And of course, as a reader, we don't know how the text is going to continue. Like just the story that I told you. I suppose that most of us, when you read a story that I am out of petrol and there is a garage around the corner, that probably you can expect that A says, okay, now I'm going to drive to the garage. But it may well be that A is so afraid to get out of his car because he is in the middle of some part in New York, that he does not dare to go to the garage. Do you see what reading is? So you fill in the gaps, and when you proceed in the reading, the text is going to say yes, what you suppose that the text is going to say happened or it did not happen. And this is why that when you read that at a certain moment, after a few moments, you have to say, hey, I did not understand what was said there. And this is why, for instance, what many readers do you know what they do? They start with reading the conclusion. But all this effort that we put into reading does not necessarily exclude the ambiguity of the text, and some texts remain mysterious. And I would like to show that now by two examples You remember, those of you who were here yesterday, that Bruggeman pretends that the story of paradise is like a copy of what happened in the life of David. So in other words, a writer says that the biblical writer who wrote the story of Adam and Eve, when he wrote that, had in mind what happened in the life of David. Now let us come back to the life of David, what happened in the life of David, and let us come back to the story of Adam and Eve. In the life of David, there is that story about his sin with Bathsheba. I read the text, and I'm going to show you, and I suppose you all will notice the ambiguity of the text. It happened towards evening, when David had risen from his couch and was strolling on the palace roof, that he saw from the roof a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful. Now, do you see that I can interpret that story in many different ways? I can say the old King David, and he becomes the bad guy, the perverse looker. Or I can say, after all, Bathsheba must know that she could be seen. Do you follow me? And the text goes on, and the text goes on. Then David sent messengers and had her brought. She came to him, and he slept with her. And do you see again how I can interpret that in two very different ways? I can say, there it is, the king, because he has power, he can abuse, he brought her. But I can also say that the text says she came to him. So she was very glad. She was looking for a little affair with the king. Who is right and who is wrong? And we encounter the same difficulty when it comes to the story of Adam and Eve. May I ask you to look at chapter 3? In chapter 3, I read verse 6. The woman saw that the tree was good to eat and pleasing to the eye, and that it was desirable for the knowledge that it could give. So she took some of its fruit and ate it. She gave some also to her husband. And do you see now how evil Eve was? After she had fallen into sin, even to tempt her husband. And you all know that long history that makes of Eve the temptress, and that all the evils in the world are from, you know who I mean. But if you go back to the text now, and you read the text very carefully, did you notice that the text says, she gave some also to her husband, who was with her? And does the text not seem to indicate that if he was there with her, that he seemed to have agreed on everything? And I hope that you have seen, by choosing the example here of Genesis and choosing the example of the life of David and Bathsheba, that probably the person of the reader is going to affect the selections you make. Yesterday a person asked about feminist readings. Do you guess what the reading will be in a feminist perspective? And so we move now to the second part of the theory. I indicated that the first part was the ambiguity of the text, the difficulties of the text. The second now is the world of the reader. The world of the reader. Last night we have said that the author of the book, that the meaning of a text depends on the author, but that author, of course, had lived in a particular cultural, historical, linguistic, social, and political conditions. And we spoke about the whole world behind the text. But now this morning, we have to realize that the same applies to the reader. No reader is an innocent reader. We all read and rewrite the text, but we are all conditioned by similar factors. We bring our world through that text, and so there is the whole world in front of the text, the world of the reader. And the reader has special life experiences, presuppositions, ideologies, interests, competencies, methods that are used. And of course, the questions that the reader asks of the text depend on the interest that the reader has. Did you ever notice that when you read a text, and you read that same text a week later, or you read that same text a month later or a year later, that you still are reading the same text, but that probably you are finding all kinds of different things? And this is that even if you read a text a dozen of times for many years, there will always be new aspects of a text which were never noticed before. And if you have ever worked with a Bible group, for instance, you will notice that suddenly a person says something, you say, how come I have never seen that in the text? Because we all read through our own glasses. All our readings are subjective. And because we as readers change, the text changes with us, even if the text is still the same. And the reading of the Bible, of course, does not escape that fundamental principle. And you all know that if you read the book of Job, when you are yourself in the middle of suffering, that book of Job is going to speak to you in a very different way than when you read it when everything goes well. You all know that the teaching of Jesus was understood differently. If you look in the Gospel of Luke, Luke says, how happy are you who are poor? And Matthew says, how happy are you who are poor in spirit? Which is not exactly the same thing. They have understood something different from what Jesus was saying. And I suppose that they understood a little bit like if I would say when North Americans or South Americans would listen to the message of Jesus. New discoveries, new awareness, or changes in society are going to affect our readings. Now, after the theory, I would like now to come to the story of the Fowl of Paradise and show you with 4 different examples how the reader, what we as readers are, is going to affect the interpretation of the text. I will give you 4 examples. The first example is how different a pre-scientific or a scientific informed reading of that text is going to be. So a difference between a pre-scientific or a scientific informed reading. Many readers never had a question about the creation. When I see in chapter 2, verse 7, Yahweh God fashioned man of dust from the soil. Then he breathed into his nostrils a breath of life, and thus man became a living being. And for many centuries, nobody had a problem. Why not? God could have done it like that, to take some dust and make a human person. And when we continue in chapter 2, verse 21, so Yahweh God made the man fall into a deep sleep. And while he slept, he took one of his ribs and enclosed it in flesh. Yahweh God built the rib he had made from a man into a woman and brought her to the man. And people had no problems with that. It's in the Bible. It's clear. Clear. No problem. And perhaps you know that this text even was used at a certain moment in the middle of the 19th century by a doctor, James Young Simpson, a Scottish physician. That was when anesthetics were invented in medicine, and this now caused a very important moral problem. How can a doctor have the right to use anesthetics? Because after all, that means that person is no longer human, not thinking anymore. And you know the argument that doctor found. He said, of course we can use that anesthetics. Look, the first surgery, God did it himself. But when besides the Bible, science started suggesting a few theories about the origin of the world and of humanity, do you see that a scientific informed reader now is forced to return to the Bible? And then, of course, when you return to the Bible with your science, and when you know now that God did not create us like that, but that our grandparents were monkeys, you remember the theory of evolution? Then, of course, we have to go back to that text and try to explain that text. And to say, hey, that text is not a scientific text. That text speaks with symbols, with images. And, of course, the writer came to those images. Why? Because this is the only way that I can imagine how God created us. Is there something more simple than, how do you find out how my watch is made? Take it in pieces, okay? And then you will know all the pieces of my watch. Of course, I realize that will be the end of my watch, but that's another. So, how do I find out how we are created? Very simple. When you die, what happens when you die? Your last breath, and the rest becomes dust. So consequently, this is indeed how God created us. We are at the same time, we belong to the earth, and at the same time, we have God's life in us. Beautiful. Not scientific, but beautiful. When it comes to the rib, also images, beautiful images taken. And why is that the writer uses the rib? All kinds of reasons are given. For instance, in the Sumerian language, there is a word ti, which means at the same time rib and life. So in other words, the wife comes from the life of the other one. Beautiful images, etc. So scientific discoveries, when people did not have those scientific discoveries, why would they discuss the text? But if you have the scientific, you go back to the text, and the text has to be interpreted in a new way, illumined by what we know through science. A second difference of reading, I'm going to suggest to you a Jewish and a Christian reading of that story here, or at least one aspect of it. The first difference is if you are a person without scientific background or a person with scientific. Now, another possibility which is going to affect the reading is if you are a Jewish believer or a Christian believer. By the way, there is no such a thing as to say this is Jewish and this is Christian, but I would like to stress simply one little point of the story. You remember that we said a few minutes ago that who can become he? And this then would refer to the messianic interpretation that the Messiah is going to be the one who is going to give the victory to humanity over evil. Now, there are Jewish scholars who accept that the translation would be he. And the Jewish scholars, even in the beginning, you know that the Septuagint, so the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, was done by Jews, and they indeed selected for he. Now, do you see the difference between the Jewish scholar and the Christian scholar? Even if both now select and take he, understand it by he as the Messiah, do you see that as a Christian I'm going to say, and that Messiah is Jesus? While the Jewish person is saying, okay, it's the Messiah, but I'm still waiting for the Messiah. A difference between a Christian or a Jewish interpreter, even if you read the text in the same way. And now I come to a third difference, and a difference that was hinted at yesterday, the feminist reading. And I would like to reflect now on that story here of paradise seen from a male or from a female perspective. And you all know that important changes are happening, are not finished yet, but are happening, that hopefully we have a greater sensitivity to the numerous injustices done to women. And so I think that this also makes us aware about a lot of things. And I would like to start from an author, De Fren, a Belgian scholar, who wrote in 62. Now, 62 is not the Middle Ages, eh? I speak of 1962, eh? And when he gives a commentary on the story here of the rib, he says that this text expresses three clear ideas. And I'm going to read what he says. It expresses what? First, he says, the solid bond between husband and wife. Secondly, that story clearly expresses the special dignity of the man. And thirdly, the natural equality between men and women. Did you hear me? I repeat that. The special dignity of man and the natural equality between men and women. If I understand that clearly what he says, he says equal, but one is better. Special dignity, but they are equal. So in a sense, that means that men and women are equal, but that he is superior and she is inferior. And in a sense, you know, this is not surprising, that at that time nobody even, can you imagine if you would have tried now? They would shoot you. No, but I mean, 30 years ago, that could be written, and nobody objected to that. I've seen never in any of the book reviews on that book any, reference to that. And of course, this is, in a world that was thinking a bit differently. But now, as you all know, with women liberation movements and also by the increased number of women exegetes, we have come to a few other readings. And now you know what? Now suddenly, some exegetes, they say, indeed, men and women are equal, but she is superior. And I would like you now to show how that same text, that same text is going to show you that indeed the male is superior. And after that I will show you how that same text proves that indeed the woman is superior. And may I ask you now, for the time being, not to take position. After I explain, you do whatever you want. That's irrelevant. No, but for the time being, may I just ask you to be open to the arguments that people give, okay? Not take any position, just listen to the arguments. So I'm going to give you first the male. By the way, when I say male, it doesn't mean that all males read it like that and all females read it, but you understand what I'm saying here, huh? Okay. I'm going to give you a few reasons why. First of all, the first argument for the male interpretation. Who is created first? So the man is created first. So he was the first in the mind of God. And if you add now everything that we know in biblical writings about the firstborn, you see how important the firstborn is. And if you continue the story, you will see now that everything that's created is now in function of the one who was created first. So obviously, he is firstborn. Now on the other side, the other type of reading, they say, wait a minute. In Genesis chapter 1, the text which precedes, that you don't have on your pages, but that many of you must remember. If you remember the story of creation in Genesis chapter 1, do you remember the first day, this and the second day, etc.? And the first day the light, and the second day the waters in the sky, and the third day the earth, etc., and it goes on. And what is created at the end, in the afternoon of the sixth day? Humanity. Now all scholars, male or female, irrelevant, everybody says, now, at the end comes the masterpiece. And so those scholars, they say, but isn't that strange? In chapter 1, you say that the most important comes at the end. And when you start reading chapter 2, you say that the most important is the first one. Your principles are not logical. Follow the same principle. And if you say that the most important comes at the end, then in our story too, the most important comes at the end. Do you see makes sense, the two arguments? And not only that, but now they stress a few other interesting elements that in mythology, quite often the gods, when they created, they acquired much more experience. They acquired much more experience. And indeed, if you read that story, the same thing. God created a male there, okay? And he says it's not good to be alone. And then he tries, he creates, and by the way, if you know the story, he does not create a woman first immediately. He starts with a few animals. And of course, it became better and better. Acquired experience. And then finally, the masterpiece. Makes sense, Makes sense. Second argument in the struggle for the superiority and the equality there. If you look at 2, verse 22. Yahweh God built the rib he had made, taken from the who come from. And go now to verse 7. Because now we read that God fashioned men of dust from the soil. Do you hear the same expression, from? So if you say that the woman is less because she was taken from the man, then be logical, and then you must say that the man is less than the earth, because the man comes from the earth. Please don't make decisions yet. Third argument. Chapter 2, verse 18. Chapter 2, verse 18. Yahweh God said, it is not good that a man should be alone, I will make him a helpmate. Now, could it be clearer? Could it be clearer? Do you see that the text says very clearly that the woman is the helpmate of the man? And you know what that has meant during the centuries. Now the other side says, wait a minute. Because the Hebrew word which is used here for helper is etzer. And this is extremely rarely in the Bible used for a human being. Most of the time that word refers to God. Many of you must know the psalm, our soul awaits the Yahweh, he is our helper and our shield. So you mean to say that God is then less than you because God is the helper? Is it not because you are weak that you need someone? And if you need someone because you are weak, you go to someone who is stronger than you are. I'm going to take one more example of arguments. You know, it's not only the men who know that the woman is less. Even the serpent knew that. Because did you notice that the serpent started with a woman? And the serpent knew, and this is very interesting. If you go to the history of the exegesis of that text, all the reasons why they explained why the serpent tempted the woman first. Can you guess a few? That the woman is weaker, that the woman is more curious, etc. The other side says, wait a minute. Who does the talking? Who does the talking in the story? Who does the thinking? The woman is the one who uses her brains. And the man only thinks on his belly. By the way, I just indicated also who was with her. You remember? Who was with her? Now, if you remember, those who were here last night, you remember that I told you that the serpent is connected with the cult of fertility? Now, do you understand? Then it's obvious that the story starts with a woman. Because why? Because she is the one who gives life. And if you read now in the book of Jeremiah, you will see that the prophet Jeremiah accuses the woman in Jerusalem of going to that cult, to the idolatry of the serpent. And you know what the women say to the prophet? They say, yes, we did it. But was it without the consent of our husband? And so obviously that story receives a total different meaning than we had thought before. I have given you two types of readings, male and female reading. Now you can make up your mind, whatever you decide, that the one that you prefer. I continue and I give you now a fourth difference in reading. I have spoken about a pre-scientific and a scientific reading. I have spoken about a Jewish and a Christian. I have spoken about male and female. And I would like you now to finish those reflections with a religious and a materialistic reading. A religious and a materialistic reading. You remember how Bruggeman, the one that I quoted last night, has interpreted that story. Bruggeman says that the Yahwist was seeing and had witnessed what happened in Israel. And that the experience of David and how God treats David is now reflected in this story. In other words, God acted with David, and this is the way God acts with any human person. You remember that last night. Now there are other readers. There are two, one in France and an American here, who have suggested what you could call, what they call a materialistic or a Marxist reading. And they refuse to read the biblical text here as a sacred text. They say we have to read that text as any other literary text. So in other words, we have to remember, we have to take into account the social, political, and the economic conditions of the time. And they say, you know, all the women are leaving. At least one male too. And so they say that religion in society quite often plays the role of the status quo. Religion quite often preaches obedience to the authorities. And you start seeing gradually how they are going to read that text. They say the Yahwist wrote at the time of the monarchy, at the time of Solomon, you remember. And this was a tremendous change in the political and the economic and social conditions of the society. Because until that time, Israel, they were nomads. But with the monarchy, they became, of course, now settled. They were farmers. And now what appears in Israel were the different classes, the rich and the poor. And of course, the king now was considered as the representative of God on earth. And of course, obedience to the king was obedience to God. And the person of the Yahwist, because he could write at that time, was certainly, I speak about what those people say, belonged certainly to the elite and the rich and the civil servants. So he was, insisting upon the role of the institution of the monarchy. And so what he tried to do in that text, tell the people, you know what happens if you listen to the king? So in other words now, when you read the text and the text speaks about God, the text does not really speak about God, but the text would speak about the king. Okay? And now let's read the text. Let's read the text. In that perspective, God plants a beautiful garden. And do you see how, of course, Solomon was living in a beautiful palace? And there God puts humanity in that garden, not to enjoy it, but to work, to keep it, and to guard it, says the text. And this is exactly what Solomon did with the people. The people had to work in his fields, in his properties. And says the text, in the garden they could have everything except the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Now what does that represent to here? The knowledge. And of course this is now refused to the poor. Because as soon as the poor start knowing too many things, they are going to rebel. And that's why the king says, you don't have the right to go to the schools. And the serpent is now, represents what? The serpent is the one who says, you know that if you eat it, your eyes will be opened. You know that if you acquire a little bit of education, that you will realize how that king is oppressing you. And then, of course, the peasants, when they rebel, do you see that the king has the power to kill them and to... did you hear a complete different reading? I have suggested now 4 different readings and how the person who reads it, the perspective of the person of the reader is going to affect the reading, the interpretation. And I would like to finish now this lecture this morning by looking briefly at the advantages and also the limits of a reader-centered interpretation like we did yesterday for the author-centered. What I have described this morning are approaches taken by new methods in biblical studies. They are what is called the reader response criticism. They are what is called feminist interpretation, what is called Marxist or materialistic interpretation. And all those methods now favor the reader because it is the reader who gives meaning to the text. These methods, they trust the reader who dares to approach the text with much more creativity, knowing that many readings are possible. And since readers are so different, and since readers themselves change continually, the same text will receive many meanings. There is a French writer who said once, and I think he was so right, Roland Barthes, who says, a literary work has eternal value, not because all people discover in it the same meaning, but because it invites each reader to more than one meaning. On the other hand, so I've given you the advantages, but I would like to make you aware of the limitations of it. The preceding examples have shown that there is not only a variety of interpretations, but that sometimes we have contradictory interpretations, conflicting interpretations. It's not simply that one adds something, but they are conflicting, contradictory. The reasoning of the male interpretation or of the female interpretation may be sound, may be correct, but is that possible? That the same text could speak of male superiority in the equality between a man and woman, and at the same time of female superiority between male and female? Is it possible that one can accept that the same text, when it speaks about God, means indeed God, as in the religious reading, and then that God does not mean God but means the king, like in the materialistic reading? Is that possible? all our readings are subjective, like I have said, because we all read through our own eyes. And nobody can avoid that. And this is good. That's the only way. And this is why texts are interesting to read. We read them always through what we are and through what we bring to the text. But could it be that some readings become subjectivistic? A reader may use the text to prove his or her point or theory. And then the text is no longer a text that we try to understand, but the text then becomes a pretext. And the basic distinction that has always been made between exegesis, in other words, what we bring out of the text, and eisegesis, what we impose upon the text, when we read our own interpretation into the text, remains valid. Now, and this now is the conclusion of this morning, who or what is going to decide that this subjective reading, they are all subjective, who or what is going to decide that this subjective reading respects the text and is sound and good exegesis, while the other reading is subjectivistic and pure exegesis?
Dr. Vogel has graciously agreed to take any of your questions. Would you please use the mics that are in the middle aisle?
Yes, I think I did.
Okay. There's one dimension that I'd like you to focus on. I think it's an assumption here in terms of the text itself, the writer, and many readers, though obviously from your last example, not all, and that is the dimension of faith. Where is the perspective of faith or an experience which is called or labeled or determined to be an experience of the other, of God? Where does that come into the perspective that you're developing in these 3 lectures?
That's one dimension of the reader, if the reader decides to do so.
Is it also a dimension of the writer? Because I didn't hear it developed last night.
Yes, obviously.
Is it always a dimension of the writer,
I mean,
or not always?
I'm sorry. Do you refer to literature in general, or do you refer to the scriptures?
I'm referring to the scriptures.
Okay, the scriptures, of course, and it's a witness of a faith community. I did not explicitly say that because I take that for granted, that we accept the Bible as a religious book. I think at least I mentioned that at a certain moment last night, that the text comes from a religious experience.
But the last interpretation you just gave accepts the possibility of people approaching the scriptures as a non-religious document.
Of course, it's possible too, sure. Like, just to give you an answer to that, like it is possible that I read the Mesopotamian creation narratives purely as old documents. So I can read the scriptures purely as an information about the history of Israel, for instance. Is that answering your question?
Yes, thank you.
I just have a couple of comments, I think, rather than questions. Phyllis Tribble had another way of reading that story about the creation of men and women as the creation of sexuality, simultaneous. That what we've translated as a man, God creating this man, is a neutral word, as you pointed out here, without sexuality, so that we could think of the creation of an earth creature, an asexual creature who looks around at sexed creation and gets a hunger for something better than asexuality. And so God puts the creature to sleep in the simultaneous creation. That's another...
I know that. I
like that one because...
And this afternoon I will come back to that in more detail if you wish.
Okay. The other thing is that...
Pardon me, when you say I like that...
I like
No, but just a minute. When you say I like it, do you see... You speak from the perspective
as a
of
reader.
No, but that's interesting. Eh?
Yeah.
I don't say that's right or wrong. That's not my question. But do you see again the question that I asked at the end? Now, who or what decides
Is the judge. Well,
if that reading is acceptable?
In her case, she's going back as a biblical scholar using the Hebrew word, so I find that has some value in it that some of the other readings might not have.
I'm sorry. All the readers that I quoted today, they were all biblical scholars.
Yes, I know. I've read them. But I'm just saying that I find some more persuasive than others.
Oh, yeah, but that's okay. That's fine. No, that's fine. That's fine.
Now,
no
the other comment is about God. I don't think it's... I think when we look at the creation, I mean, one of the things of the 20th century physics is that light acts both as a particle and as a wave. And those two things seem contradictory. And yet, there was a big fight about was it a wave, was it a particle? And it's both, depending upon the way in which it's used, depending upon the way we see it. There's a spectrum, or there's a stream of particles that can be beamed and broken as an electric beam. The thing that I think is the most interesting thing of the 20th century is that our understanding of God is so much more mysterious, in a way, than what we were led to believe, if the universe is fashioning forth who God is. So the fact that we would have contradictory interpretations, double stories in the Bible and all that, the world of physical science seems to say, well, the universe is like this.
Exactly.
And if the universe is like this, then somehow this fashions for the Creator, then why do we want to tidy it all up into some neat little package and say that there's only one truth?
Yes, exactly.
That's not a question, that's a comment.
That's a comment, and I'm very grateful for what you say, because that's exactly what I tried to say too. But at the same time, do you see that there must be somewhere, somehow, something that controls those subjective readings? I don't know if you agree on that. Is it possible that a text can have those two contradictory, conflicting interpretations? Can it mean that God means not God, but means the king? You know, things like that. Those are the questions that I would like to question this afternoon. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Vogels. I just want to remind you before we leave that the third lecture will occur in this place, same place, at 2 o'clock this afternoon. And you're all welcome back. Hope to see you again this afternoon. Thank you.